Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Pavis Devastin, Communication Officer from IMF Communication Department. I would like to welcome everyone here in this room and our online audience to the press conference of the Intergovernmental Group of 24 on International Monetary Affairs and Development, or G24. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that we have simultaneous translation in English, French, and Spanish. It is my honor to introduce the distinguished panel at this table. The chair of the Minister of the G24 at the center is Mr. Recto, Secretary of Finance of the Philippines. To his right is Ms. Candelaria Alvarez Moroni, Argentina's Undersecretary for International Coordination, representing Mr. Vice Chair, Minister of Finance, Mr. Luis Caputo. To the left of Mr. Chair is Second Vice Chair, Mr. Olawale Edun, Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister of the Economy of Nigeria. And of course, at the other end of the table is the Director of the G24 Secretariat, Ms. Iyabo, Masha. Without further ado, may I invite Mr. Rector to give some remarks. Mr. Chair, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Members of the press, distinguished guests, good morning. Thank you all for joining us today in this press briefing. This morning, we had the opportunity to have a productive exchange of views and experiences on some of the most pressing issues confronting the global economy today. We are hard-pressed on multiple fronts. The suffering caused by conflicts and humanitarian crises around the world is vast, and the affected region's recovery, reconstruction, and long-term development cannot wait. They demand immediate, forceful, multilateral action. While the global economy shows signs of stabilization, the outlook for many vulnerable nations, particularly in the global south, remains bleak. These weak economic prospects continue to haunt those already struggling to recover from the pandemic. Inflation may be easing, but rising geopolitical tensions are keeping the threat of commodity price spikes and elevated interest rates alive. These risks imperil capital flows, fiscal stability, and the very survival of economies on the brink. One thing is clear: any slowdown in the global economy due to these new economic realities is bound to hit developing countries the hardest. But while current circumstances have made it more difficult for us to achieve a sustainable and inclusive future by 2030, we believe that it remains possible with the right priorities and concerted international cooperation. Thus, we continue to call for a more agile and strong-willed IMF and World Bank. We need heightened development cooperation, scale-up support, and innovative solutions as we navigate the headwinds to foster peace, stability, and prosperity for all. And a key issue that underpinned our discussions is the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods system. We acknowledge the significant evolution of the system over the decades, yet we must recognize that rapid transformations are occurring at an unprecedented pace. We must therefore critically assess if the Bretton Woods system is adapting fast enough to the rapidly changing and increasingly volatile global environment. To this end, the G24 has identified 4 key reforms that will enhance the system's effectiveness and empower both the IMF and the World Bank Group to better serve their members. First, the IMF must create a new mechanism to support countries with sound fundamentals during liquidity crisis. Second, to meet its mission of eradicating poverty on a livable planet, the World Bank needs more ambitious goals for its concessional and non-concessional windows, commensurate with the challenges of achieving inclusive and sustainable development by 2030. Third, the sovereign debt resolution framework must be reformed to deliver comprehensive, predictable, swift, and impactful debt relief, addressing the urgent needs of vulnerable economies. And fourth, we must accelerate governance and institutional reforms of the Bretton Woods institutions to increase the voice and representation of developing nations. Without improvements and bold actions, decades of individual and global efforts to eradicate poverty and inequality, combat climate change, and invest in growth-enhancing projects will be put to a halt, if not reversed. Thus, we are counting on our recently concluded meeting to set an unprecedented multilateral cooperation and action. All of these points are comprehensively discussed in the communique and press release we have prepared for your perusal. With that, we are now ready to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So now moving on to the Q&A section, I would like to remind you that when you raise your hand, please identify yourself, your outlet, and please identify the chair members that you would like to address the question to. So now moving on to gentlemen in the third row, please. Reuters.
Thank you so much. Reuters Adiri with Arise News. I've got a question actually for the three of you. Mr. Recto, you talked about the need for liquidity and buffers. The Philippines serves as a really good example. You're one of the fastest growing economies in the developing Asia region. Business process outsourcing, revenues have passed $35 billion. I wanted to find out, what is the Philippines doing so well? Is it a well-educated workforce, or is it constant electricity? What's the secret? Is AI going to disrupt that going forward? For Candelaria, Alvarez, reforms have been taking place in Argentina. Javier Milei recently, I think it was last month, vetoed a bill that was going to increase financing for public universities, and students have been protesting. How patient do you expect the residents of Argentina to be with the reforms that are taking place? And for Mr. Wale Edun, the CBN governor, Olamide Cardoso, at the last Monetary Policy Committee meeting in Nigeria, mentioned that FAC allocations, Federal Accounts Allocating Committee allocations, are causing, he's noticed they cause the Naira to depreciate when those disbursements are made. What do you think needs to be done to address that? And then two, you recently, I think it was about a month or two ago, talked about the need for single-digit interest rates in Nigeria. Do you think that's ever going to happen with inflation being at double digits and a hawkish monetary policy path in Nigeria? Thank you.
Thank you, and let me remind you that I hope your question will be under the purview of G24 discussions, but let me ask the chair to respond to the questions. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your question, and thank you for noticing the Philippines. Well, the Philippines in the second quarter grew by roughly 6.3%. For the first 2 years of this administration, we've grown about 6%. We are following our macro fiscal framework of reducing the deficit over time. We expect the debt to GDP to be way below 60% by 2028. Today, we're roughly at 60%. On the expenditure side, we're spending roughly 5 to 6% on infrastructure, maybe a similar amount also for human resource development, particularly in health and education. You are correct that the BPO industry is growing by about, well, we collect roughly 35 billion in revenues a year. We also have a robust remittance of roughly the same amount, about $35 billion a year as well. That helps our consumption. 70% of the economy is household consumption. And public investments have also generated most of that growth as well. AI is a challenge, but in the Philippines, the BPO industry is already adapting to AI. So, thank you for your question again. Thank you.
Mr. Edun would like to address the question.
Thank you very much. Let me answer it within the context of the discussions of the G24. Fundamentally, of course, foreign exchange and liquidity generally is very difficult. There are countries that they are reforming their economies domestically. They are they key into the rules-based world trading system, and they do have debt sustainability in terms of debt to GDP. However, they have liquidity constraints, particularly foreign exchange with relation to debt servicing of their foreign debt, but also their domestic debt. And I think to bring that's the context within which the discussions of how to help, and in fact, it's the IMF is specifically focusing on how to help. It's a sort of bridge financing that takes a country that does have its fundamentals right, but it gives it enough time for that adjustment, and probably helps it with heightened debt servicing, which is just for a period. And clearly, regard to Nigeria, the key about the foreign exchange market really is supply. And of course, as you know, we have we are an oil-producing country. We just need to get our oil production up, and that would deal with that issue of foreign exchange supply and pressure on foreign exchange every time there are large flows. In terms of single-digit inflation, of course, the Western world, the rich countries, they have effectively defeated inflation, and that's why their interest rates can come down. The governor of Central Bank in Nigeria, in the context of high inflation, is continue with monetary tightening, and that is the orthodoxy of the day, and it's one which he's following. Thank you.
And Ms. Maroney on Argentina.
Yeah, thank you. Is it on? Yeah. Is it on?
Yes,
That's perfect. So going back to the question on Argentina, just as an important framework, G24 has been working on the need for emerging market development and developing economies to try to put their economies in the right place. Minister mentioned the need for the international financial organizations to give liquidity or to provide accessible liquidity for countries like Argentina and others to be able to get back on our feet. For the government of Argentina, it's really relevant. We do think that there's a need for a fiscal anchor on that sense. What happened with the education law had to do with the idea to keep the budget where it has to be, and it has not to do with kind of cutting education. It has to do with evaluating costs and expenditure in the right way. So I think that's...
Thank you so much. Going back to the floor. Gentleman in the fourth row, please.
Hello, my name is Adam Bisudi. I'm with Politico here in Washington. Just turning to the U.S. election, obviously we've seen the U.S. policy on trade change to a more protectionist stance. We've seen a lot of industrial policy. Regardless of who wins the election, how do you see the U.S. involvement with multilateral organizations represented here and the WTO, and what is the impact of maybe a less engaged, more transactional U.S. on the group of countries, the G24 and your own? Thank you.
Mr. Chair, and maybe Secretary would like to respond. Or
yeah. Well, we are concerned that there will be a setback on multilateralism, particularly in trade as well. And we know that the driver of global growth is more trade. So that is a concern. In the Philippines, we count on our relationship with the United States to do maybe more outshoring to the Philippines, and hopefully that will be done also with other members of the G24.
And if I can add, if you look at a communique, the last paragraph there actually addresses this issue. And it's not just about the US, it's also about different countries all over the world implementing protectionist policies. And we've seen the impact of that in sectors that contribute more to growth and development in many countries. So where do we go from there? What we're calling on is for the WTO to become the center of trade discussions, trade negotiations, and for the World Bank and the IMF to rise up to a much more multilaterally engaged organizations that will be able to at least influence the kind of policies that countries take one way or the other. Thank you.
okay, thank you. I'm going to go online with the question I just received from Sophie Frasan, New First Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, a member of G24, is currently making attempts to emerge out of the economic crisis. What can you tell us about the G24 position to support countries like Sri Lanka, and also for the island nation to secure financial facilities at reasonable condition? Mr. Chair, and maybe Iyabo? Yeah.
Yes. I would say that Sri Lanka has come a long way from where it was 2 years ago. The last IMF Article 4 assessment does show that growth is picking up. the fiscal buffers are coming up, and also import duties are rising. So that indicates that the country is making some recovery. As for the position that the G24 takes on this issue, the way it affects Sri Lanka most is on the debt sustainability issue. And so what we are calling for is that countries, especially middle-income countries, should also have a framework, a forum where they can negotiate with their debtors. As it is now, the common framework only works for low-income countries. Only low-income countries are part of the common framework, but middle-income countries can be part of another forum called the Global Sovereign Debt Resolution Roundtable, which is not really an association, an organization that delivers any form of debt relief. It just fosters common understanding. So that's what we're calling for. We want very timely, very comprehensive reduction in debt for countries, and also for both middle and low-income countries to qualify. So that is where I see it working out. If things work out and the discussion in that area picks up quite fastly, then we could see the likes of Sri Lanka and maybe even Lebanon and a few other countries benefiting from that. Thank you.
Thank you. Back to the floor. Maybe I'll take one question from the side or come back to you. I've seen your hand. Sir, on the third row. Sorry, fourth row, yes.
Hi there, Matthew Kendrick with G0 here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Recto, you said that developing countries would be hit by the hardest by any slowdown. I'm going to ask an uncomfortable question, but the U.S. election has two very different results, one of which would likely be much more inflationary and lead to more trade tensions. Could each of you tell me a little bit about how your economies are preparing or thinking about the possibility of a Trump victory and associated trade tensions and inflationary pressures that could be a headwind to growth?
Mr. Recto, or, yeah, please.
Well, in the Philippines, we do have a relationship with the United States. We have a mutual defense treaty, and we're hoping to leverage that relationship so that we don't get much affected. We understand that many U.S. companies are also interested to invest in the Philippines. We do have a partnership also, the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines with regard to our security arrangements. And we expect more investments to take place also in the Philippines.
Anything to add from Mr. Edun or Ms. Maroney?
Thank you. I think the issues and that we are contending with in Africa mean that we in many ways we're bystanders to this all-important election. Yes, we do have the African Growth and Opportunities Act, which tries to open up the U.S. market to African manufactured products. I don't think that will be affected in any way by the results of this election. And generally, what we are finding is that at this particular time, the economies of trade generally, there's a reversal of globalization of trade. There's a move to protectionism in these countries. There's onboarding of production, and all these things tend to work against the developing world's ability to benefit from expanding trade, and thereby use that opportunity for investment, for growth, and for job creation and poverty reduction. So overall, I think that we are not that affected specifically, but that in general, we continue to ask for an improved global financial architecture that provides us with more concessional funding at scale, particularly for those countries that, as I said earlier, are undertaking the macroeconomic reforms that everybody agrees are sensible and will lead to better lives for their people. Thank you.
Anything to add from the macro broad perspective?
Yeah, just very briefly, I think what was just mentioned by both ministers is it's the right sentiment in the emerging markets. We do think, or at least for Argentina, this is the U.S. is a strategic partner, and whatever the elections go, we do think that we need to keep having that channel open. Trade is a quite relevant issue. Financial issues are quite relevant. Governance issue in institutions also will be something sensitive to work with the new administration. So we do think it's gonna be something quite interesting to see in the short term. Thank you.
You, sir, in the second row right here.
My name is Obin Nachima. I work with This Day in Nigeria. My question is meant for Mr. Wale Edun. So, like Mr. Recto said in his opening remarks, a lot of G24 countries are having challenges implementing structural reforms and adjustment programs. I would like you to speak specifically to the case of Nigeria. What are the key lessons that have been learned from the structural reforms being implemented in Nigeria today? And looking back, are there better ways these reforms could have been implemented to limit the level of disruptions? Also, you met with the IMF MD and team yesterday. We'd like to know some of the discussions from that meeting and how does this relate to debt sustainability for Nigeria? Thank you.
Mr. Edun, if you'd like to respond.
Thank you very much. When we talk about, and I'll take the last one, debt sustainability, and also reform generally. The G24, I think it's better to talk within the framework, to talk beyond Nigeria and more about developing countries as a whole. The requirement really for support from the international community, from the development partners, from the multilateral development banks, is that you undertake reforms that lead to sustainability at a macro level. And the key lesson that I think I would focus on is that in devising these programs and carrying out the reforms, what is particularly important, because the benefits are over the longer term and the costs are front-loaded, it's important that the social safety nets that will help the poor and the vulnerable cope with the upfront costs, with the spike in their cost of living, is adequately planned for and dealt with. So it shouldn't be a question of it's an afterthought that you now decide that there need to be certain poverty alleviation initiatives. And linked to that focus on helping the poor and most vulnerable cope with the cost is communication. I think one of the critical things in carrying out these macroeconomic reforms that are so fundamental and clearly they are necessary, otherwise they would not be implemented, is that communicating what is being done, what is to be expected, and also the timing, as much as possible, the timing of the various activities, and then communicating what actually has been done. So if it is a program to give direct benefits, direct transfers of funds to a group of people, then it should be published. There should be a dashboard that people can follow, thereby engendering and building public trust. I think those are the two important things that I would say you need to have for all of us at the G24 and developing countries in general. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. I will have to go back to, I have time for two more questions. Let me go back to the far end of the room right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Thierry Augier from Latin Finance. A question on climate change. Do you think the development banks, MDBs, are doing enough to tackle climate change? And especially our shareholders of MDBs, are they doing enough to tackle this issue? Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Rector, you would like to...
Short comment, never enough.
Minister, you want to jump in, or Ms. Maroney, or Iyabo, on climate change?
I will say that the ambition is there. They really want to do a lot, but there's the financing is just not commensurate with the level of ambition. So that's also one area where we have called on them to demonstrate the ambition. Thank you.
Sorry, if I may, since you had asked me, the thing I would say on climate change is for a poor country such as Nigeria and others that are actually endowed with fossil fuels in particular, must take a realistic approach to climate change, because it is the resources that we have that we must use to industrialize, to modernize our economies, while being members of the global fight against climate change. We are signatories to the Paris Accord. We have our target for net zero, and while sticking to those, we must take a realistic view that we need to use our fossil fuels to develop our economies. Thank you.
Thank you. And last, I'm sorry,
just
please.
very briefly, there is an issue we have been discussing on G20, G24, and other forums, the need to development banks to keep in mind their core objectives. And then, as you mentioned, there is a need to we do have an ambition climate agenda, but we do need to respect the emerging markets' right to develop first. So there is a need for financing for other development issues that are not directly linked to this.
Thank you. And last question to the lady at front.
Thank you. I'm Nancy Naji from Nigeria, and my questions will be to Mr. Recto and Mr. Wale Edun. Earlier on at the World Economic Outlook, we were told that inflation is almost 1. So I'd like to know how the Group of 24 is actually interpreting that, especially with, the fundamentals in the developed world getting a little bit better, and what are the risks that are posed to the Group of 24. Then also to you, Mr. Rector, you reeled out 4 key reforms that the G24 is asking from the World Bank and the IMF. Are you looking at timelines for these reforms? Then over to Nigeria's finance minister and the second vice chair. One of the reforms there is, heightened development support. That reform, what does it mean for African economies, for example? So I would really like to take a look at that, and perhaps what are the timelines that you're expecting, and is there a Nigerian agenda within these 4 key reforms? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to invite Iyabo to address on the reforms of Bretton Woods institution as well. But first, Mr. Rector and Mr. Edun would like to respond on inflation.
Yeah. On inflation, I think for next year, the global inflation rate will still be relatively high, lower than this year, but something like 5.8% thereabout. No? I still think that would be high, and because of that, the interest rates while it is going down, it remains high, and that's why we're also calling for the World Bank to reduce the cost of borrowing. This will be very beneficial to the developing economies. On the time frame, maybe Iyabo could elaborate more.
Yes. Well, the Bretton Woods initiative itself, the reform, they just started. So now they are in the process of consultations, going around countries, going around regions. So I will say that at a minimum, maybe by next spring meeting, they will have an update on where they are in the process, and maybe some final decision by the annual meetings. In any case, these things have to go through the boards of both the IMF and the World Bank for ratification.
Thank you. I think around this time last year, we were still dealing with heightened levels of inflation, particularly in the developed countries, and that meant elevated rates of interest as they put as their number 1 priority the fight against inflation and tight monetary policy by the central banks. That has changed, and there is now, as we are seeing, monetary easing, or at least easing of rates of interest by central banks. But that's in the developed world. In the developing world, rates are still high, and that fight against inflation means that the interest rates also will remain high. But as far as the developed world is concerned, lower interest rates translate to more affordability. Nobody wants to borrow, nobody likes to borrow, but when it becomes necessary, it's something that must be managed as well as possible. And so the first port of call is concessional financing, IDA financing, for instance, from the World Bank. And what the developing world continues to call for is larger sums that can really make a difference, not just to be able to help a country cope with its immediate payment needs, but to have funds to grow the economies. That is what the fight against inflation translates to for the developing countries. Victory there or success there for the developed world means that they should be able to make more resources available. And I must note here that the IMF has reduced their charges, a 36% reduction in their rates, and their excess charges is significant, and it is in the right direction to help developing countries get the resources they need to develop and grow.
Thank you so much, Minister and Secretary. Thank you so much for the questions. Unfortunately, we're at time. Thank you so much again for joining this press conference. The G24 communication has been posted at imf.org, and the transcript of this conference will be made available later. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.